you get the bright idea, jump overboard and swim ashore.
We're there about 12, and you're at Montauk, Long Island Road in the
Phoenix Project.
fields on the New Mountain Sea.
By this point, you'd be hard-pressed to meet someone who hasn't seen Stranger Things. As a matter of fact, the latest season, Season 4, broke Netflix's previous record of most time streamed by an English-language show in its first week with a staggering figure, 335 million hours streamed by viewers from May 30th to June 5th. To say then that the show is simply popular is an incredible understatement. With its mix of dazzling special effects, good cast chemistry and performances, and a storyline chock full of homages to 80s horror and sci-fi classics, it's easy to understand how it earned the spot as one of Netflix's top shows. It's a retro nostalgia security blanket for anyone born in the 80s and 90s, and a reinvention of the hits for the youth. But what if I told you that Hawkins, the fictional town where Stranger Things is set, might not be fiction at all? What if everything was true? Join me on today's episode as we infiltrate the military base in Montauk, New York, as we discuss the Montauk Project. But, and this is a big, juicy but, before we do, I need to ask you to perform emergency surgery on the subscribe button by aggressively clicking it back to life with CPR, followed by gentle compressions of the like button. Now, back to the Montauk Project. In the evening hours of August 12, 1983, Edward Cameron, later known as Al Bielek, and his brother Duncan ripped through a hole in the very fabric of space and time from the year 1943 while participating as part of an experiment aboard the USS Eldridge during World War II in what is now known as the now infamous Philadelphia Experiment. If that all sounds familiar to you, it should, as I have covered Al's amazing story in a prior episode. I highly encourage you to click the link in this video to hear more about his account. That describes, in detail, a failed US Navy experiment to render an entire warship, in this case, the USS Eldridge, invisible by encasing it in what is now known as an electromagnetic bubble. But instead, it teleported the ship and crew with catastrophic consequences. During the test, the brothers, who were in the control room as it became incredibly unstable and quickly grew wildly out of control, forcing them to seek an escape. They yelled for help over the radio, but when communications went out, they flung the door to the control room open and ran for their lives. Panicked, they fled what could have become their tomb below deck, and went topside to the main deck of the Eldridge, reeling in utter horror at the sight of the ship. The crew were mostly dead or dying, some fused to the ship itself. Those that hadn't died or been gravely injured had seemingly gone mad from the effects of whatever had just occurred to them. The brothers had been protected from much of the harmful effects of the experiment while below deck, in the experiment's control room, and, after surveying the carnage on the main deck, decided to jump over the ship's railing into the strange aura that surrounded the ship, into the cosmic unknown. As reported in my previous video, the brothers Cameron were eventually sent back to the decks of the Eldridge to stop the experiment in 1943, from which they had escaped by any means necessary, on orders from their boss from that time, 1943, Dr. John von Neumann, now a much older man, in 1983, where they had ended up after entering that mysterious time fog that surrounded the Eldridge, and who was now a lead at the Montauk military base, tasked with carrying out various experiments. While they did stop the Philadelphia experiment by destroying the ship's equipment after being sent back from the future, Duncan decided to leap back into the time fog in 1943 that surrounded the vessel, leaving a stunned Al still aboard the ship as it phased back into the 1940s. What then happened to Duncan? Where did he go? This is his story as much as any of the others. The story of Duncan Cameron and the Montauk Project, and how he may be the inspiration for one of the most popular characters on television today. Crashing back into 1983 after entering the time fog, Duncan was in really bad shape. The effects of time travel had done a number on his body, and he began to age rapidly, a man untethered from time, ultimately close to death. He had quite possibly saved the Earth, but at a heavy cost. Dr. von Neumann and the others at Montauk, knowing he was extremely valuable, didn't want to let him simply die. That could have disastrous consequences for not only Duncan, as he barely clung to life, but for the timeline itself, and could potentially create bizarre time paradoxes, smashing the fabric of reality into a million fragmented pieces. Von Neumann hatched a plan, and using the same time displacement equipment used to send the brothers back to 1943, got a message to the year 1947 and convinced Cameron's father to allow them to transfer Duncan's consciousness to another son, who was, as of yet to be born. But to transfer an entire consciousness to another person, they would have to follow the Earth's complex biorhythms, and would not be able to do so for almost another 2 decades. Thus, in 1963, Duncan was reborn after Montauk was able to transfer his consciousness from the year 1983 using their technology on the base. Are you following all of this so far? To tell the next part of our story, which ties a little more neatly into Stranger Things, we need to introduce Preston Nichols. Preston Nichols was an electrical engineer with a specialization in electromagnetic phenomena, working for a defense contractor named BJM, who became keenly interested in psychic research when, in the early 1970s, he discovered that telepathic communication acted in a very similar fashion to radio waves. Nichols already knew how radio waves worked, but telepathic communication? Had this ever been looked into before? I mean, really looked into? I mean, if Preston was an arrow, he now found his target. Let's fast forward a little bit to the 1980s. Preston, at this point, had begun working with self-described psychics in an attempt to figure out how it all worked, when he noticed something peculiar. They all seemed to have some sort of stoppage of cohesive thought at or about the same time each day. When he was able to trace the source of whatever was seemingly halting their ability to think, it led him to the Montauk Air Force Base, which sat silently nearby, with its large, semi-automatic ground environment system, or SAGE radar tower, looming ominously over the town of Montauk. Something was going on at the base, which was supposedly closed, but in his obsession, he had to know the truth. Eventually, he was able to gain access to the base. Nichols and a friend named Brian, who himself had strong psychic abilities, were exploring the derelict base when they discovered a homeless man who appeared to be living on the property and claimed to be a former employee of the base. He confirmed that staff had been conducting illegal tests and experiments there, described some of the equipment they had been using, and said a terrible creature had been let loose by some force a year or so before, causing the military to close the base. Perhaps the strangest of all, though, was the man's statement that Nichols had been his boss on the project. Brian, using his psychic abilities, was able to confirm that the man was telling the truth. But why couldn't Nichols remember this at all? A short time later, after they had finished snooping around the base, a man appeared at Preston's lab to see if he could help him repair a piece of audio equipment. The man, you might ask? None other than Duncan Cameron. After some talk, Duncan seemed interested in learning more about Nichols' side project, psychic research. Preston, sensing that Duncan had some sort of psychic ability, decided to show him the Montauk base to see if it sparked something in the young psychic. Upon arrival, Duncan seemed to immediately recognize the place, although he had claimed to have never been there before. He was even able to show Nichols things like where the bulletin board was in the mess hall, and key details like certain areas of the facility and what they had been used for. When they went into the transmitter building of the radar tower, though, Duncan seemed to go into a trance. He began spouting out information at a rapid rate. Preston, rushed over and had to physically shake him out of it. And once he did, Duncan, who had by then shed layers of mental programming, revealed to him that he had actually been sent to kill Nichols and blow up his lab. It would seem Nichols had irritated whoever was funding this black op, and they wanted him out of the picture for good. However, with Duncan now out of his brainwashed daze and having most of his memories back, he and Preston set out to discover what had really happened at Montauk. Accounts vary, but over time, Preston and Duncan both had seemingly recovered most, if not all, of their repressed memories of what had happened at Montauk, along with others involved, like Al Bielek. According to them, the base was used for, among other things, mind control and remote viewing, or the ability to see what someone is doing or thinking using nothing but your mind from a distance. Time travel and time tunnels, or opening a literal tunnel in space-time and being able to view whatever is on the other side. Like in a modern video game like BioShock Infinite. They were also allegedly able to time warp or bend space-time to allow for parallel versions of a person to exist on the same timeline. With that revelation, Nichols was able to explain how he could seemingly be working at one job at BJM while simultaneously working at Montauk. Lastly, Duncan was said to be able to conjure objects from the ether of creation itself using nothing but his mind. He could literally think of something while in a deep state and bring it to life. But how the heck were they able to do all of this? According to Nichols, they had constructed something called the Montauk chair, which was a device that a subject sat in while in an altered state that amplified their psychic abilities to almost superhuman levels, sometimes at the cost of the user's sanity. The alternate timeline version of Nichols was present for many of these experiments, which often used kidnapped children as test subjects for these truly harsh and brutal sessions, where they were being used to develop some sort of psychic soldier program. According to Nichols, however, on August 12, 1983, he and a few colleagues, including that timeline's Al Bielek and a small group of scientists assigned to work on the project with him, had had enough and came up with a plan to put an end to all these experiments, which left unchecked could destroy reality itself if they were to go out of control. Between the Philadelphia experiment, the kidnappings, the chair, the psychic warfare program, it was time to put an end to this evil once and for all. As Duncan opened a time portal while in a psychic state, Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron from 1943 were seen from the other side. But the researchers were careful to keep the current timeline versions of the brothers from seeing the past versions of themselves, or risk creating a time paradox. Nichols seized this opportunity of distraction to whisper something to the 1983 version of Duncan, a prompt of, "The time is now," to activate him while he was in the chair. And in his deep trance-like state, a horrible creature was summoned from deep in Duncan's subconscious mind. It began ripping through the base, destroying anything in its path. The scientists and soldiers desperately tried to cut the power and stop this monster from killing everyone on the base. And the only way to do so was to shut down all of the equipment amplifying Duncan's thoughts. It wasn't until Nichols cut his way through the conduits and cabinets to the transmitter of the chair, and the alternate timeline versions of Bielek and Cameron destroyed the equipment on the Eldridge, back in the past as they were all in sync, that the monster faded away into the nothingness from which it had emerged, back into the ether of Duncan's mind. The two events, linked by the brothers on two different timelines, had finally been stopped, and the loop was closed forever. The military abruptly halted the project after the events of August 83. The test subjects were brainwashed. Special operations teams made sure the site was scrubbed and everything of importance was removed. The lower levels of the facility were filled in with concrete. Staff were reassigned, and everything, as it so often is when a covert op is involved, was covered up. This is only the tip of the iceberg with this story, but for more on Montauk, I'll have to talk about that another time. You can clearly see where the Duffer Brothers, the creators of Stranger Things, got some inspiration from this case for the show. Montauk, New York sounds an awful lot like Hawkins, Indiana. A quaint small town on the outside, but sinister forces lurk on the inside, operating from the shadows. Monsters from beyond our plane of existence cross over from one reality into our own to cause chaos and carnage. Warping and parallel reality travel become possible thanks to technology we can't truly control or understand. The Hawkins Lab is run by officials who reportedly work for the US Department of Energy in Stranger Things. In Montauk, the very real Brookhaven National Lab was allegedly behind it all. Rogue scientists, masquerading as officials of the US Department of Energy, operating with little to no oversight, conducting psychic experiments, sounds an awful lot like Eleven's backstory, with Duncan perhaps being the inspiration for her character. The setup of scientists working to create child psychic warriors in a small town is almost identical, as a matter of fact, with some liberties thrown in for Hollywood flair. It's a great tale, whether it be fact or fiction, and in the world of science, it's only a very small step to either side to make it one way versus another. One decade's science fiction becomes the next decade's science fact. I like to think, though, that if it is indeed fact, we at least got a happy ending for the Cameron brothers. After all this, and I haven't even covered half of it, Ed, or as he's known now, Al Bielek, and Duncan were free. After surviving everything, heck, even being reincarnated, they were out to finally live their lives and tell us their incredible story. Without even realizing it, millions of people around the world know at least a little piece of what they disclose to the world in the form of a little show called Stranger Things. And their memories will now live on forever. And I, for one, think that's pretty nice. Until next time, everyone, I've been your host, Tinfoil Tom, saying, I'm ready to believe you.